All right, good morning, everyone. So first, I just want to say that this is my first ever language event, so I'm absolutely excited to be here and to finally get to meet a lot of you face to face. So I really want to thank LangFest, Tetsu, Joey, and the rest of the team for bringing me out. And I want to thank you for coming to see me speak. So today I'm going to talk about how to use what you know, how to apply your outside skills to your language studies in order to become a more efficient learner. Now I know efficient is kind of like a buzzword and it's overused, but I've found personally that these strategies really do make you a more effective learner because you're basically taking the knowledge that you've gained in learning and in doing other things and then just giving them a little bit of a tweak so that you are able to use them for your language studies. And these are things that you've already successfully done, so it doesn't take much for them to become like your greatest assets as a language learner. So today, what I'm going to talk about, as I said, is how to use those skills that you've built up doing things like music, like martial arts, like engineering, and things like that in order to make the most of your language studies and the things that you do to learn languages. I think it's a really great way to learn languages. It requires a little bit of creativity, but it is a fun task, and it is a task. So I'm not just going to talk at you for this entire time today. I'm actually going to ask for a little bit of audience participation. So I have an activity for you at the end because I don't want to send you on your way in order to try and work this out on your own. I want to give you a chance to try it here today, and then that way you can also ask me questions at the end if there's anything that you don't understand about this process. So before we get into that, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. I know a lot of you may be a little bit familiar with who I am, but I want to tell you some of the things that I've done because I'm going to be talking about them today. And so I just kind of want to give you a brief overview. My name is Shannon Kennedy. I run a blog called eurolinguist.com. I'm also a language encourager over at Fluent in 3 months. But before I decided that I loved language learning and that was my thing, I was and am a professional musician. I play saxophone, flute, and sing. And through that, I've had the opportunity to record, tour, and perform with a lot of really amazing people. And my group, Groove Ltd, has had the honor of being in the US Billboard charts. I have a master's degree in ethnomusicology, which is basically an interdisciplinary field between anthropology and musicology. So I've studied really interesting things like the use of music in Irish mythology, the use of the body as an instrument, and the use of the English language by non-native English-speaking artists and songwriters. I've studied several languages, and I'll talk about some of them and some of the examples that I give. But that's enough about me, so let's get into today's topic. So whenever we learn something new, we approach it as exactly that, something new. But you don't actually have to hit the reset button each time you pick up a new language or an additional language or when you tackle something like a new part of language learning in general. There are a lot of things that you're already doing that could be great language learning strategies for you. And can I ask just really quickly, how many of you in here, you work in language learning in some way and that's what you do? Can you raise your hands? Okay. And of those of you who just raised your hands, did you study or learn anything else before you decided that you were going to go into language learning? Can you raise your hands again? Okay, so most of you. That means that every single one of you here in this room makes up the perfect audience for this talk. So good job coming. All right. So when I first started studying languages, it was at university. Well, seriously started studying languages. And I did it as a part of a class, so I had a teacher who told me exactly what vocabulary I needed to know, what grammar rules I needed to memorize, and everything else that I needed to learn in order to succeed on tests. And the thing I found personally about language learning in school is that it's not very cumulative. So you basically memorize a set of information, take a test on it, forget it all. Memorize a new set of information, take a test on it, forget it all, and you kind of repeat this process. When I got out of school and I decided that I wanted to keep doing languages, I found that this just didn't work for me because language learning outside of school is incredibly cumulative, which means that everything that you learn builds on what you've learned in the past. And school didn't teach me how to do this for anything really. And so I sat down and I thought, okay, is language learning even something that I'm capable of doing? And then I realized that there was something else that I had learned long term, and that was music. So I decided to sit down and look at some of the strategies and methods that I used to study music and see if I could revamp them a little bit and apply them to language learning so that I could learn that long term as well. And in doing this, I gained a whole new mindset and a whole new series of methods that I was able to use to become a better language learner. So these are some of the things that musicians do to study music. They spend hours and years practicing. They take private lessons. They do classes. They do performances. They learn to read music. They learn music theory, and they study music history. When you compare this to language learning, on a really shallow level, you've got hours and years of study, private tutoring sessions, classes, conversations. You learn to read, you learn grammar, and you study culture. So already, on a very surface level, you have a lot of comparisons that can be drawn, but it's not enough to just analyze it and say, okay, there are similarities, there are comparisons. You have to take action, you have to do something actionable. And none of these things are particularly actionable, they're just like a random list of similarities. So I decided to take a magnifying glass to the things I actually did to learn music to see if any of them could be applied to language learning. So here's what I came up with. The first, I tried to include as many embarrassing pictures of myself as I possibly could, just for your amusement. Okay, so there's two ways to listen. You probably know what these are. They're active and passive listening. Musicians do both. I know that there's a lot of language learners out there that say that passive listening probably isn't a great thing. And if you're thinking that it's going to teach you new words, vocabulary, and stuff like that, it's not a very effective way to study languages. But musicians, the way that they use passive listening is for immersion. So they're basically just looking to surround themselves with the music that they're studying so that their ear gets used to the way that the music sounds. And you can do the same thing with language learning. So you surround yourself with the language so that you train your ear to recognize the way that it's spoken, the rhythm with which it's spoken, the way that the sounds of the language. And then we do active listening. Now when we do active listening, we do this in a couple different ways. One of which is we do it with the subtitles on and with the subtitles off. So this here is a chord chart, and this is a version of the subtitles on, because for a musician, subtitles on means that you have a sheet of music in front of you. So this is a chord chart. This is basically an outline of what's going on in the music. And we would use this to kind of figure out what's going on in the music, mostly using our ears, but it's kind of a summary that gives us some guidance as to what might be included in that. So as a language learner, this would be the equivalent of maybe listening to a podcast that's on a specific subject. So maybe you're listening to a podcast on Russian politics in Russian. So you would know that the podcast is about politics, and then you'd perhaps read a summary of that particular episode, and you would use those as tools to help you figure out what's actually being said specifically. So this is what a musician would do. That's how that would look. Then there is this. This is actually the same piece of music. This is a note-for-note transcription of what one musician is doing in particular on that song. And so this would be like actually using subtitles for a film. And in this case, you have all the words and the vocabulary given to you. They're there, but you're listening for more subtle things. So as a musician, if I were practicing with this while listening, I would be looking to see if I could figure out how the saxophone player was phrasing the music, how he was articulating the music, and more specific things like that. So you can do the same with language. So you could listen for accent, or you could listen for the way that the sentences are phrased, where, how things are connected, the types of kind of in-between words and phrases that are used, if they use inflection when they speak, how they form questions and things like that. So the one thing about active listening that musicians do, regardless of if they're doing it with the subtitles on or the subtitles off, is they have their instrument in their hands. So they're not just sitting listening to the music and paying attention to it, they're actually engaging with it in some way. So they're playing along. Now with the subtitles on, this would be, they're using that as a prompt. So perhaps if you're watching a film and the dialogue is going on, you would use that to improvise your own responses. So maybe one of the characters asks someone how their mother is, and rather than responding the same way that the other character responds, you could instead say something like, "Oh, my mom is great, you should come visit soon." And when we have the subtitles off, we're basically just training our ears to pick up as much as we can, and we're pushing ourselves to recognize as much of the music and as much as what different players are doing on the recording. Something else that we do as musicians is we practice consistently. When I was studying music performance at university, I had days where I practiced 8 to 10 hours a day. But then, because I was a university student, I had days where my first class was at 8 o'clock in the morning and my last class ended at 10 o'clock at night. So I wasn't practicing every single day, and it drove my saxophone teacher nuts. So he told me that what he wanted me to do is on the days where I didn't have time to work on the new music that I was learning, he just wanted me to find 5, 10, 15 minutes to work on long tones, which would basically be the equivalent of doing flashcard review. And there's a couple reasons that you want to practice consistently. One is muscle training. Now musicians, or saxophone players, we have what we call our embouchure, and this is the way that you train the muscles in your mouth to produce a good sound and good intonation on your instrument. And so when you practice regularly, you're actually keeping those muscles in shape, just like if you go to the gym for weight training. If you take days off and you take a break, it's going to cause problems for you when you go back to it. So it's kind of the same thing with music. With language learning, you have muscle training that goes on as well. You're actually training your mouth, your voice, your tongue, your throat, all to coordinate so that you're able to produce the sounds that are required for you to speak the language. So when you're not practicing those skills, that's when the language kind of feels awkward when you go to speak because it's unfamiliar. Whereas if you're regularly speaking, you're actually training those muscles to use that language. And another reason that practicing or studying consistently is important is because you're telling your brain that the information is important. When you study inconsistently, your brain says, okay, I'm not seeing this very often, so it's not that important. But when you're studying regularly, even if it's just review to keep things fresh in your head, you're telling your brain, okay, this is important, so I need to put it somewhere that it can be accessed easily. Another thing about music and language is that they're both better with others. Music and language are things that are primarily done in solitude. There's a lot of background work, a lot of studying and practicing that goes on in order for you to be able to perform in a language or in music with other people. But because there's so much that you do kind of in the background and on your own, it's easy to forget that music and language they both exist to be shared. And you really get the most out of them when you share them with other people. So that's an important element to both as well, because there's just something about sharing a language with someone else that's just incredibly motivating. And sometimes that motivation is frustration where you're like, oh, that was terrible. I never want that to happen again. So then you go and you work on it and you do it better the next time. And then there might be, oh, that was amazing. I want that to happen again. So then you go and you work on it and you look for more opportunities to do it again. Another thing about doing music and language with other people that's important to note is that you want to surround yourself with people who are better than you. In music and language, when you are around people who speak the language or perform the music better than you, you're going to try and reach that level. Now, you may not be able to get there, but you're going to push yourself to get as close as you're capable of getting. Whereas if you surround yourself with people who are not better than you, you settle. And so I'm not saying that you need to ditch all of your monolingual friends, not what I mean at all, but you do need to put yourself in situations where you are with people who are better than you. Okay, so writing things down is an incredible memory aid. I know a lot of you guys know this, writing things out by hand. It's scientifically proven as well. But I had a summer in particular where my band was really busy. And so we were performing 3-4 times a week. And we were getting bored playing the same songs all the time. So I decided to write out a bunch of new charts that we'd have new things to perform every week. And I wrote them all out by hand because at the time it was the fastest way for me to do it. I was really slow entering it in on the computer. And so when I took my saxophone and I sat down to learn these songs, I realized that I had actually already memorized them just from writing them out by hand. So I've applied this principle to everything else. If you've seen me at any of the other talks, you'll see that I take notes by hand. And I don't remember everything that I write down, not by any stretch, but I do remember far more than if I take notes by any other means. All right, now 2 very specific approaches. When a musician is learning a new piece of music, there's a lot of different things that we're thinking about. And when you get a new piece of music, 2 of the most important things are usually the notes and the rhythms. Those are the kind of the first things that you figure out before you work on all the rest of the stuff. So the one-note approach is from one of my teachers who told me that we can only concentrate on 1.5 things at a time. And when you're working with a challenging piece of music, sometimes the notes and the rhythms are one piece of information too much, so you have to eliminate one of them. And what we eliminate are the notes. So we pick one note, any note, doesn't matter which one, we work out what the rhythms are, and then once we're comfortable with the rhythms, we can then add the notes back in. So this is a piece of music that I was actually given for a recording session. It was written out by hand, so it was hard to read. There was a lot of things going on here. It's not super rhythmically complex, but it's written in the key of C, and for those of you who are musicians, the saxophone's not in the key of C, So I was actually transposing this while sight reading it and figuring out the notes and the rhythms, which is one piece of information too much. So what I did is I eliminated what the notes were, worked out what all the rhythms were, and then I could add the notes back in. And so what does this look like in language learning? In language learning, let's say you're struggling with Chinese word order. So the words in Chinese and the word order in Chinese is just too much information. So you eliminate one thing. You eliminate the Chinese vocabulary, and you focus on just the word order. So you would, like, for example, instead of saying in English, you would say, like, oh, I'm going to the store with my mom tomorrow. In Chinese, you say, I tomorrow with my mom am going to the store. Instead of, can you please put this book on the table, you say, please, you take this book, put located table on. And then once you get comfortable with the word order, you can add the Chinese vocabulary back in. So that's how this would look in language learning. Another technique that we use is what's called isolating passages. So let's say you're working on this piece of music here. You start at the beginning, and you play through, and you get to this section that I've highlighted, and that's a pretty tough section, so you mess up. If you have bad practice habits, what you'll do is you'll go back to the beginning, and you'll try again. And then you'll get to that passage, and you'll probably keep just hitting your head against that brick wall. If you have good practice habits, what you're going to do is you're going to isolate that passage, work it out, take a small step back, add a little bit of context, take another step back, add a little bit more context, and you'll work your way back to the beginning. And then you'll play through, and you'll repeat this when you get to another section that you find challenging. In doing this, you spend the majority of your time on the thing that challenges you the most, and the least amount of your time on the things that do not challenge you. So how does this look in language learning? Let's say you're struggling with pronunciation. Maybe the French R is just way too hard for you. So you work on the R sound by itself. And then you add it into a word. You put it at the beginning, risque. You put it at the end, faire. You put it in the middle, étranger, marcher. Then you put it in the context of a sentence. So, c'est un risque pour l'étranger d'aller au marché acheter du fer. So then you've got the sentence, and you just keep taking steps back and adding more. But you slowly add it in so that you're not overwhelming yourself with information that you need to process. All right, so minimalism, something outside of music, for those of you who aren't musicians. I am not a full-on minimalist by any means. I love books far too much to ever successfully be one. But I do apply certain minimalist practices to my life because it makes me feel less overwhelmed, both mentally and physically. So one of the things that I took from minimalism was the approach of less is more. And the way that I do this is with the number of resources that I use. So I tended to be a bit of a resource hoarder. I know I'm not the only one in here that collects resources. And so what I would do is I'd use all of these tools that I had as a way of procrastinating. So I'd work through a couple chapters of a book. I get to something that was challenging or something that I didn't want to tackle yet. I put that book down and I pick up another one. And then I'd work through the first two chapters again. Now, I didn't feel guilty about this because I was actually working on the languages. I felt like I was doing something. But the thing is I wasn't doing what I needed to do. I wasn't challenging myself and pushing myself to move forward. So instead, I had a really broad understanding of the languages that I was learning. I was really great at basic verb conjugations and introducing myself and buying train tickets, but I couldn't do much beyond that. So when I limited the number of resources that I could use at any given time, it actually forced my hand. I had to move into those next chapters. I had to tackle those next things. So working with a limited number of resources is a great way to apply the minimalist approach. Another thing that I took from the minimalist approach is what sparks joy. This is from The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. It is a life-changing book. I know that sounds cheesy, but she taught me to think of minimalism in terms of what you want to keep rather than what you want to get rid of, which is how I was thinking of it before. And you decide what you keep by what sparks joy. Now, this is great because just like you would approach this with your home, it's the same way that you would approach this with language learning. So if cleaning your house doesn't spark joy, that doesn't mean that you can get rid of all your cleaning supplies. You still have to keep your cleaning supplies because you're not going to enjoy the things in your house that spark joy if your house is messy, if it's dirty, if it's covered in cooking oil, if the carpet's got all sorts of things all over it. So you still have to clean your house in order to truly experience the joy of the objects that are in it. Just like in language learning, you can't stop studying grammar if grammar doesn't spark joy. It just means that grammar becomes something that supports the things that you enjoy. So you do things like you play video games, you read books, you watch movies, you listen to music, whatever that is for you, You do it in your language, but then you just support it with your grammar studies. You do your housework. Parenthood. I'm a fairly new mom. My son just had his first birthday earlier this year. And already in the first year, I have taken away a few things that have allowed me to become a more compassionate learner with myself. So I'm a little bit more forgiving of some of the things that I do. One of the things that I took from being a parent is that you need to approach the problem from different angles. So my son doesn't speak yet. When something is bothering him, he cries. So we basically have to go through the process of elimination to figure out what's bothering him. Is he hungry? Is he hot? Is he cold? Is he tired? Does he just want a hug? Is he bored? Does he have a hair wrapped around his finger? So you have to try all these different things until you find a solution. You need to do the same with your language learning. So let's say you're studying with Korean honorifics. You read an explanation in your course book. You just don't understand it at all. It's just totally over your head. So you have your tutor explain it. You still don't really get it. You watch a couple videos on YouTube, then you start watching a TV series, and so you get a little bit of context, and eventually you hit on a solution and something clicks. But it wouldn't have happened if you weren't trying to tackle it from all of these different angles. Another thing that I took from parenthood is the power of a break. Now, I love my son, and I want to spend all the time I can in the world with him, but I do have other responsibilities that take me away from him. I have to work. So it gives me time away, and these breaks, they allow me to process, and they give me the time to go back to him with a renewed appreciation for the time that I spend with him. And the same is true for your language learning. So breaks within reason, within moderation, they're really healthy for your language learning because they allow you the time you need to process the information that you've taken in and for you to go back to your language studies with a renewed appreciation for the language that you're learning. And the last thing that I want to share about parenthood is that the work you put in isn't always visible. When I'm teaching my son to eat with his own spoon, to go down the stairs, or to pull up, sometimes it seems like he's not paying attention, that he's not interested, that he just doesn't want to do it, or that he's not getting it. But then suddenly a couple days later, he'll have seemed to have figured out how to do it overnight. Now, it's not because he figured it out overnight, it's because the work was going on in the background, it just wasn't always visible. And the same is true of your language studies. We often call these plateaus. So we feel like we're not making any forward progress, we feel like we're in a plateau. But the thing is if you're going at your studies consistently, you are making progress. Sometimes you just can't see it. The only way you see it is when you add a little bit of context. You look at where you were 6 months ago, maybe a year ago. Or when you have those moments where you're like, oh my gosh, how did I do that? That is that background work. So let's talk about a few things for those of you who aren't parents, minimalists, or musicians, because I know that's not everyone in here. Let's talk about sports. So, performance pressure. Athletes know that what they're capable of doing in the practice environment is not what they're capable of doing in the performance environment. So what they do is they prepare for this by doing a lot of repetition. They train and they do the same things over and over and over and over so that when they get into that performance environment, for you the speaking environment, a conversational environment, you're prepared because you don't need to think about what you're going to do anymore. That practice, it just takes over and it becomes automatic. Another thing for sports is health. This is super important. If you want your studies to be productive, you need to treat your body right, you need to sleep well, and you need to eat well, because otherwise you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. Science. So scientists, they do a lot of experiments. Sometimes the experiments are to prove things wrong. Sometimes the experiments are to prove things right. Sometimes it doesn't really matter if it's right or wrong. It's more about getting a result. And in language learning, you want to approach your studies in the same way. You want to be able to experiment. You don't want to be afraid of trying things because whether what happens is right or wrong, you're learning, no matter what. So it's important to approach it with this mindset. Another thing that scientists do is fieldwork. I got this from my anthropology studies. Fieldwork is where you go out and you observe whatever it is that you're studying in its natural environment, as natural as it can be when you're observing it. And so you want to do the same for your language. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go travel to the country where your language is spoken, because I know that that's not possible for a lot of people, but it does mean that you want to observe the language however you can. So even if this is films or TV shows or watching vloggers on YouTube, you just want to see the way that the language is actually being used by people who speak the language, because there's a lot more that goes on in communication and in using a language than what a course can teach you. There's nonverbal cues such as body language, facial expressions, you've also got tone of voice, and you have rhythm, like do people talk faster when they're excited, when do they slow down, what is the phrasing like on like when they actually speak the language. And for you money-savvy people, investing. So people who invest know that they need to accept uncertainty. The same is true in language learning, because you never know what's going to happen when you go into a conversation, but you can't stop yourself from having a conversation because you're afraid of what's going to happen. Investors also know that you need to take risks to make gains. So again, by having that conversation that you might be a little bit uncomfortable with, you're going to make gains. You're going to get that motivation of actually having spoken to someone else, that energy that happens when you share a language with someone else. And you won't have that if you don't take the risk of putting yourself out there and using the language. They know that they need to accept mistakes. Investors, if they buy a stock that just totally bombs, they don't go, that's it, I'm never investing again. Instead, what they do is they go, okay, that was not fun, but now I know better next time. And they make better decisions the next time, so they learn from their mistakes. Investors invest in what they truly believe in. So this is studying a language that you want to learn. This isn't studying a language that you think you need to know. This is investing in something that you really want, because it is a long-term relationship that you're building with your language, so it's important that you want it. And you need to do your own research. So people like me, language bloggers, we talk a lot about the things that work for us, what we like using, but you need to figure out what that is for you. So I could tell you that one particular resource is great, but it might be the worst thing for you. So you need to do your own research and find out what is the right fit for you, what works for you in learning your languages. And don't put your eggs in one basket. So investors, they don't just buy one stock. They buy a bunch of stocks. They build a really well-rounded portfolio. The same is true for you. You can't rely on any one thing to teach you a language. Instead, you build up your portfolio of resources that you use. Now back to the minimalism thing. This doesn't mean you use 20 resources at a time. You use your 3 to 4 at once, then once you finish something or something is no longer appropriate for you, you swap it out. So you build your portfolio and you want it to be diverse. Okay, so some of these things may have been obvious to you, but I hope that you've gained a couple of techniques or mindsets that you can adapt for your language studies. But just in case, I'm actually going to have you do that exercise that I promised now. So I want you to take your notes. If you don't have anything to write on or write with, I have paper and pens for you up here, so you're welcome to come and grab them if you need them. And what I want you to do is I want you to take your notes and I want you to divide it into 2 columns. On the left side, I want you to write down some things that you've learned to do outside of language learning, anywhere from 1 to 5, it doesn't matter. Leave a couple of spaces between each thing that you list, and then look up at me when you're done so I know you're ready to move on. Look up at me when you're ready so I know. On the left side, I want you to write something that you've learned to do outside of language learning, 1 to 5 things. I've played for Berg. Yes. You're welcome. No, it's just, okay. Do you need a pen? Okay. Actually, I think on one of the slides I had a picture of me with her. All right, it looks like most of you are looking at me, so I think you're ready to move on. Now, in the right column, what I want you to do is I want you to write something you did to learn that skill. Now, don't think like my very first example where I compared language learning and music really broadly. I want you to think more specific, more along the lines of the one-note approach or isolating passages. So try to come up with at least one technique that you used for each thing on your list. And again, look up at me so I know you're ready to move on. Not resources, maybe techniques more, or mindsets that allow you to accomplish those things, yeah. Okay, so again, about half of you are looking up at me, so I'm assuming you're ready to move on. Are 3 of you brave enough to share something that you came up with? Anyone? Any 3 of you?
So swimming, I like swimming. It takes a lot of practice, consistency.
That's great. Anyone else? 2 more? Go ahead. Okay, routine is great. I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, so I'll pass the mic, maybe so people can hear in the back. Wow, okay. Thank you. So I've been doing research for 10 years now, which is a lot for someone of my age. I never thought about it, but what I was basically saying is when I was getting into something exciting, and I know that nobody around me could understand this phenomena, I would start to really dig into it and try to find theories that will explain what I was observing. And I was trying to be as creative as possible to find a solution to my problem. And then I would be very intense about reading every papers that could be remotely connected to that phenomenon. And the funny thing is, I think that's what I'm doing with languages right now, in the sense that when I find something exciting that I don't understand, I really dig into it and just try to follow this path, even though I have no idea where this is going to lead me in the end.
That's really great. Yeah, thank you. All right, so that is everything that I have for you. So I'll go ahead and open it up for the Q&A. So if you have any questions.
Okay, coming.
He's bringing you the
Easier
microphone.
with a microphone.
Just a really quick question. What languages do you speak and at what levels?
It depends on the day. I speak French, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and English fluently. I also have a pretty good level in Italian and Spanish, Croatian, Russian, and a very basic beginner level in Korean, and I just started learning Japanese.
Another question? Don't be shy. A few minutes, yes.
working on something, how do you know when to stop? When is the best time to stop?
I find that your body kind of tells you because your focus starts drifting. So when you start focusing on other things or getting distracted by other things, that probably means it's a good time for you to take a break. Did that answer your question, or was it more? Okay.
Probably have time for a couple more, so. Oh, okay.
Hey, thank you. Very good talk. I'm wondering if this can be applied to like anything. Like when we were doing the activity, I don't know why it came to me, but I wrote down buying a house. And then as I was doing it, I was like, yeah, there's stuff here that totally applies to language learning. Do you think that it's something you could take like any aspect of your life, any activity, anything that you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can. Whenever you do anything, there's like skills that are involved in doing that. It may not seem like you need skills to buy a house, but you do. And so in learning those things, you can actually, all you have to do is like change things just ever so slightly to make them work for language learning. But yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah. Well, break is starting soon, but since we started, I think, a little bit late, we're going to take probably a couple more quick ones.
It's just a comment. In training animals to do certain things, we use something called back chaining, where you start with the end product, and so you gradually work backwards to the very beginning, so that the animal is always going to something that it knows, and so it always finishes on a good note. And I think your idea before that you mentioned of I can't remember.
Isolating passages?
Yeah, doing the certain passages is the same thing.
Yeah. See, and that's great. That's a great point. Because actually, so I'm talking about taking outside skills and applying them specifically to language learning. But if there is something else that you want to learn outside of languages, you can do the reverse. You can take the things that you've done to study languages and apply them to other things. It works both ways.
Okay. Well, take this. I think this could be probably the last one, because I don't want to take too much time from the break.
I was just wondering, out of everything, you chose music and to share the strategies for music to apply for learning languages. So is that something you're really passionate about? That's why you chose that particular side, like music? You could have chosen gymming or swimming or something else too.
I think I chose it for a variety of reasons. The main reason was because it was the only thing that I had ever really done like really long term, and that was what I was aiming to do with languages. So it made sense to take the strategies that I did to learn music long term and apply them to language learning. But I am passionate about music. I don't think you could be a musician and not be passionate about doing music.
All right. Then I think we can go to break. Thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you all for coming.
And
Thank you.
yeah, go back in 15 minutes.